So in this video, I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about some theories of discrimination, specifically some economic theories. Um, this is not an exhaustive list. There are other broad sort of theoretical approaches to trying to understand and unpack the economics of discrimination. We're just going to kind of focus on these as exemplars. The first is a theory that comes out of the work of economist Gary Becker, in which the argument is that discrimination persists because it reflects a kind of preference for discrimination, what we would call a kind of conative prejudice. The second is Edna Bonacich's split labor market theory, in which the argument is that discrimination occurs because it benefits dominant group workers. And then we'll look very quickly at Marx's theories of discrimination that kind of focus on the idea that discrimination is harmful to working members of both the dominant group and subordinate groups, and that the true beneficiaries there are actually the interests of capital and sort of the associated interests in positions of dominance within capitalist systems. So let's start with Becker. Gary Becker was an economist at the University of Chicago. He was a sort of very noteworthy neoliberal theorist in the 1950s and 1960s. His argument was that in complex market economies, like the United States in the late 20th century, discrimination should disappear over time because it's dysfunctional. What that means, of course, is that if there is somebody who is discriminating against candidates from racial and ethnic minority groups, good candidates who exist within those pool of potential employees are overlooked due to prejudice. And firms that are turning away qualified individuals from positions based solely on the fact that this person happens to be black or a woman, or it doesn't just apply to race, right? It's just this idea of prejudice overall, that competing firms should be able to gobble up these talented individuals and benefit from their ingenuity and their hard work and the contributions that they can make to the success of the firm. So in competitive markets, discrimination should be gone, right? There shouldn't be any of it because it's, as Becker would say, it's irrational. Obviously, that isn't the case, right? So the persistence of discrimination must be, according to this logic, must be because the people who engage in it have a preference for that, right? That they have a taste for discrimination. This theory really kind of overstates the importance of attitudes. I'd say that that's probably the primary criticism of Becker's theories. The assumption that prejudice and a preference for prejudicial discrimination can account for all of the inequality that exists between racial and ethnic groups within an economy is just, you can't really reconcile that. Don't get me wrong, bias is still very much a part of discrimination, right? The bias of people in a position of hiring and of sort of parceling out various resources and opportunities. That's still a thing, and we're going to see that repeated in a number of other places when we get further into the semester. Bertrand and Mullinathon's studies on resumes and applicants with black-sounding names getting fewer calls for interviews than applicants with white-sounding names is a really good example of the presence and the continued presence of bias among people who are in charge of making hiring and firing decisions. But the vast majority of the discrimination we see is really hard to attribute to attitudes because, again, as we've sort of discussed, attitudes may only be very weakly related to discrimination. There is not a necessary one-to-one connection. You can get discrimination without prejudicial attitudes, and you can have prejudicial attitudes or racist ideologies without acts of discrimination. So the idea that there's this strong correlation between the two is kind of is a situation which, Becker is really overstating the importance of a preference or a taste for discrimination. That people will often hire individuals from racial groups toward whom they feel some degree of prejudice or even racist ideology, but because their presence is good for the company in many ways, the preference for discrimination, the taste for discrimination, gets overridden by the other benefits that accrue to a company. And that structural explanations are probably a better explanation for the persistence of inequality in within economies between racial and ethnic groups. So, when we look at things that might actually account for these continued patterns of discrimination, the economic benefits of discrimination are more likely to be accurate explanations than a taste for prejudice or a taste for discrimination. Pressure from workers, pressure from customers, right? The context-specific features of where the business exists and who its customer base is, right? Those things are at least as likely to be useful parts of the explanation for discrimination and inequality than the preference or taste of somebody in a position of hiring. So, a very popular theory, but one that actually in the end has limited empirical support. Edna Bonacich, in the, I want to say the late 60s, early 70s, generated an alternative explanation. This alternative explanation was what was called, or is what is called split labor market theory. A split labor market is just a situation in which workers are divided into two groups, right? There's a higher paid dominant group and a lower paid subordinate group. And then the lower paid subordinate group members are excluded from particular kinds of employment. And the discrimination occurs and it persists because it's benefiting the dominant group workers, right? And so what's happening here is the presence of a split labor market shelters people in the dominant group from competition that might arise from subordinate group members. And you can do this in a lot of different ways. There are lots of different ways to keep groups, members of racial and ethnic minority groups or subordinate groups from competing against members of the dominant group. The easiest way, or one of the easiest ways, is in educational discrimination. So by the time a white worker, for example, and a non-white worker reach a point in their lives where they're competing in the labor market for jobs, for occupations, the white applicants, the white candidates, are much more likely to have educational credentials that align with the expectations of potential employers than graduates of color. Another way to do it, and there are structural ways that you can kind of create that educational discrimination, and we will talk about those over the course of the semester. Another way to do it is geographically, right? You can locate firms in areas that are populated by the dominant group. And because of inefficiencies or sometimes even the complete absence of transportation options that could get unemployed workers from subordinated groups to places where the jobs exist, you essentially don't need to worry about competition from people who can't get to the place of employment. That phenomenon, again, we will talk about all of these things later in the semester, but that phenomenon is called spatial mismatch, where the people who need the jobs live in one area, but the jobs themselves are located somewhere else. And so if you do that, the people who live around the places of employment are going to be able to find jobs more easily than the people who are far distant. And related to that, of course, is, as I said, things like transit policies, right? So if you have, poor transit options, if you have limited access to transit options, that is very often sort of one of the ways in which people are kept from being able to access places where they would find jobs. Another way that this is done, although I think this is probably less prevalent now than it was maybe back in the 40s or the 50s, was the systematic exclusion of workers from subordinate groups from labor organizations, right? So unions, not all of them, but unfortunately a not insignificant number of them, used to very rigidly police their ranks, their membership, and would actively work to make sure that there were very few, if any, workers of color in many of these labor organizations. And because access to particular kind of, especially factory occupations, was contingent on being a member of the union, being excluded from membership in the union was essentially to be excluded from an opportunity to work. If you want to think of a really good example of something concrete that is a split labor market, you could look at apartheid, right? So in South Africa in the decades running up to the late 1980s, early 90s, there was a systemic organization of the labor force into two groups, right? And you had the white workers and you had black workers. And of course, the black workers were excluded from particular kinds of occupations, which meant that the white workers were able to, because the labor supply was tighter, right? There were plenty of jobs, but a relatively small number of people who were going to be allowed to have those jobs. That drives the price of labor up. So that would be how, you sort of see an illustration of Bonacich's notion of a split labor market. And finally, as I mentioned, Marxist theories of discrimination take a slightly different stance. There's some overlap in some regards with some of the stuff that Bonacich talks about in split labor market theory, but the Marxian theory, or the Marxist theory of discrimination, argues that discrimination exists because it benefits the dominant group. The way it benefits the dominant group, in this case, the dominant group is actually capital and the interests of capital, not white people or non-white people. But the working members of the dominant group, so in the United States, that would be working members who are white, and working members of the subordinate group, in other words, working people who are not white, are sort of pitted against each other in competition. And the idea is that by threatening, you could do it a lot of different ways, right? You could threaten to replace white workers with non-white workers, which keeps white workers compliant and subservient. You can organize the understanding of one's socioeconomic position as a function of the actions of some other racial or ethnic group, a kind of divide and conquer approach, right? The idea is that you as a let's say you're a member of the dominant group, and you're working and you're not getting paid as much as you think you should get paid. You're not being treated as well as you think you should be treated. That can be blamed on competition from these other groups. And then your anger toward your potential anger toward your employer is directed then toward these other workers, right? And it keeps people from forming what Marxian theorists call class consciousness, right? So when one is aware of one's sort of actual class position, it becomes possible for workers to build some degree of solidarity. And if you can get one half of a working population sort of pitted against another half. So you turn white workers against non-white workers. You turn native workers against immigrant workers, right? There are lots of different ways to do that. But at the end of the day, by getting workers to sort of struggle against and fight against other workers, that sort of makes the likelihood of workers turning against capital much, much less likely. And so it's it's different than split labor market theory, because in split labor market theory, the idea is that you create one dominant group and then you give that group significant rewards that the subordinate group members are kind of precluded from enjoying. The Marxian theory says that race and ethnicity are kind of cleavage points, but that the thing that's actually happening is you're turning worker against worker, because that will prevent them from forming any kind of class identity and class solidarity as a result. So racial and ethnic inequality, or racial and ethnic prejudice and discrimination, become kind of epiphenomenon of a kind of class struggle. And that's a sort of a different take than Bonacich's split labor market theory. And again, the degree to which you guys have a really good grasp of these theories, it's not that important at this level, right? That I want you guys to be familiar with the broad outlines of the theories. I'm going to try to find some examples that I can post to Blackboard, so you guys have an opportunity to sort of see them kind of a little bit more fleshed out. But at the end of the day, just understand that the economic dimensions that are specific to the operation of the economic system itself, that are specific to capitalism in the United States, are going to have racial and ethnic implications. That's entirely consistent with Omi and Winant's racial formation theory, which, again, you guys have kind of been introduced to a little bit up to this point. So again, we'll talk more about these things over the course of the semester, but until then, take care.